Good. Okay, well, I think it's just a few minutes before 5 o'clock, so we'll just wait a few minutes until for any people who are not joining us exactly on the spot, and then I will I'll explain why I'm in the chair and introduce our speaker for today. We'll just wait a few minutes while people to come along and join us. Okay, well, it's just after 5 o'clock. So can I welcome you to the evening lecture for the Royal Archaeological Institute. Instead of our president, Ken Smith, being in the chair, I'm afraid I'm acting as the chair for today's meeting. I'm Mark Gardner. I'm one of the vice presidents of the RAI. Ken, unfortunately, is unwell, and you'll perhaps know that if you had attended the lecture at 3:30 this afternoon. So this is the second of if you like, the offerings from the Royal Archaeological Institute today. For the second of our lectures this evening, we today have Dr. Richard Hoggart, who's going to speak to us about M.R. James's East Anglia. Richard has had a long career which has been associated almost entirely with East Anglia. He's been a part-time tutor at the universities of East Anglia and of Cambridge. He's excavated extensively in East Anglia, and he's worked as an archaeologist for Cambridge County Council, Norfolk County Council, Suffolk County Council, and he says that he's currently doing temporary development control work for Colchester Borough Council. So that sort of pretty well takes in the whole of East Anglia. And more recently, he's been working as a freelance archaeologist and as a heritage consultant. Richard did his PhD at the University of East Anglia in 2007 under Professor Tom Williamson, and he did it on the archaeology of the East Anglian conversion, which he subsequently published under a book of the same name. He's also written a book, the Book of Haysborough. I had to be corrected in my spelling, which I thought was pronounced Hafisborough, but it's Haysborough, which arises out of his work which he did on the coastline, the remains of the coastline. He's been editor of Norfolk Archaeology, and more recently, and this is particularly relevant, as you will see, he's written a heritage assessment of the Abbey of St Edmund. And I was quickly glancing at this. He sort of highlighted that it included in it a reference to a paper published in Archaeological Journal, the Royal Archaeological Institute's journal, in 1952 by Arthur Whittingham. So there is a sort of connection, but there's another connection which we will see with M.R. James. So I want to pass over now to Dr. Richard Hoggart, who's going to speak to us on M.R. James's East Anglia. Richard.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak. And it's slightly unusual circumstances. When I was booked, of course, I was going to be attending in person, and we were all going to be able to share a room and enjoy the company of each other. But we'll have to make do with online, and I hope that's hope that's good enough for all of you. As you've heard, I have a rich and varied career behind me, and one of the joys of being a freelance heritage consultant is that basically I have the freedom to explore areas that interest me, or subjects that interest me. And I've been very, very fortunate in recent years, as you've heard, to have been employed to undertake a detailed heritage assessment of the former abbey site in Bury St Edmunds, one of the foremost Benedictine abbeys of medieval England. And during the course of undertaking that research, I found increasingly, as you'll see over the coming hour, the hand of M.R. James behind the academic content of our understanding of the abbey, and in particular his role in much of our important understanding of the early history of the abbey, and particularly its archaeology. Of course, as a lifelong fan of his ghost stories, that was a particular joy of mine to then sort of have my eyes opened, if you like, to the wider realms of academic scholarship which he employed, particularly to the East Anglian region. And the reason why I'm focusing on James's East Anglia this evening is partly because, as you've heard, my own background is very much in the region, but also because of the immense contribution which James, who also grew up in East Anglia and spent much of his time here, made to our understanding of the historical environment of both Norfolk and Suffolk and the wider region. And what I want to do this evening really is share with you something of the breadth and depth of the scholarship which he brought to the region, to our understanding of its historic environment, which has underpinned much of the work that has taken place in many different regards during the course of the 20th century. And in doing so, I want to try and redress the balance as well, because as I skip through to my first slide here, it sort of epitomises what people know, or what people think they know about M.R. James, about Montague Rhodes James, who, as you can see from the dates at the top of this slide, his life spanned second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th, a period of immense social and political change. And so in terms of his response to it and the society that shaped him, a very fascinating period in its own right. But in terms of his scholarship in particular, and you can see on this postage stamp that the subtitle there for him is Scholar and Author of Ghost Stories. It's pleasing there to see that his scholarship comes first on here, because as far as I'm concerned, and as far as the work that I'm going to talk about this evening is concerned, it's that scholarship which really, really matters. But of course, more popularly, James is known as the author of ghost stories, as it also says on that stamp from 2012. And his collections of ghost stories, particularly famous, started to be produced in the early 20th century in anthologies. They've never been out of print, and they're incredibly well known. This slide just gives you a flavour of some of the different editions. This is what my bookcase looks like at home. Everyone, I think, or I would have thought most people have enjoyed some of M.R. James's ghost stories in one context or another, either read as a published anthology, increasingly listened to as audio books as well. Some wonderfully evocative readings available through the various platforms. And of course, with the internet, again, we're seeing something of a renaissance in audiobooks these days, which is encouraging for those of us who used to have cassettes once upon a time. Remember those? Showed my children once, they had no idea what it was. And then, of course, we also have the wonderful television adaptations as well, which we're able to enjoy. Again, Ghost Stories for Christmas, a classic series from the 1970s, and more recent adaptations. There are some involving people like Christopher Lee, for example. And then more recently still, we're seeing a new generation of fans coming through, with people like Mark Gatiss, for example, leading the way in terms of dramatizations and popularizations of James's ghost stories. But of course, back at their heart, the ghost stories are really just a bit of fun, as they say, produced as a piece of Christmas entertainment by a scholar who was primarily interested in other things. And here we can see interesting parallels with other figures, such as perhaps J.R.R. Tolkien or C.S. Lewis or Lewis Carroll, for example, all of whom best known, best remembered for their writings, but all of whom serious academic scholars by day, as it were. And of course, one of the major media in which we would like to perhaps enjoy James's stories best is as a live reading. These were stories written to be read aloud to a group of friends at Christmas by candlelight. And there are people out there, Robert Lloyd Parry, for example, being one of them, who are masters at telling these stories in person as part of a theatrical experience. And again, hopefully it won't be too much longer before we're back in a position where we're able to enjoy entertainments of that kind in person in an auditorium again. Remember those days? It feels like a long time ago, doesn't it? But it will come back around. But in order to give you a bit of biographical background, obviously the ghost stories are there, but in terms of the East Anglian connections that I want to explore with you, we can take you back to James's childhood, just by way of biography. And although born in Kent, at the age of 3, James and his family relocated to the village of Great Livermere, which is just outside Barrow St Edmunds, just to the northeast of Barrow St Edmunds. And here, his father, the Reverend Herbert James, was the rector. And we're very fortunate in the collections of the Suffolk Record Office that we have a series of wonderful photographs which were taken of all sorts of scenes, but including the James family. So here we have Livermere Rectory. This is one of my own photos. But here we have a wonderful archive photo. This is James's father. And he was the rector in Livermere from 1865 through to 1909. And as you can see, is absolutely the sort of the archetypical late Victorian rector, as we might imagine they should have looked. And he, in his own right, was a very important biblical scholar, and instilled into his young family a very detailed understanding of ancient history, of languages, and biblical studies in particular. James's parents are still buried in the churchyard at Livermere. Here's their tomb. And we have other family photos as well. So here, for example, is a group photograph, again from the Suffolk Record Office, this time again showing Herbert James on the right, seated, and Sidney James, the gentleman to the left, is Montague Rhodes, James's brother. And then you've got M.R. James himself standing in the centre of the photo, looking off to one side there. And a very close-knit family group who lived in Livermere for a very long time. And Livermere itself was clearly a very strong influence on James growing up, because he later in life wrote a wonderful travelogue of Suffolk and Norfolk. And those of us who do more work in Suffolk than Norfolk these days appreciate that he put Suffolk first. That's a very important local rivalry to put to bed. But in his travelogue of Great Livermere, he described the village thus. He said, "A mile more and we're in Great Livermere. The reader will forgive me a little expansiveness here. From 1865 to 1909, the rectory was my home, if not my dwelling place." And he then goes on to write rather fondly of his memories and experiences of the village of Livermere itself. Now, of course, what this serves to emphasise is that, yes, it was his childhood home, but of course, throughout much of that childhood, he was away at school, a boarder at Eton, and then subsequently moved on to Cambridge University, where he studied. And during the time of his studies at Cambridge, he then also became involved with the Fitzwilliam Museum. So he held the role of assistant director, as you can see there, from 1886 to 1893, and rose to the role of director from 1893 to 1908. And again, this is something else which is often overlooked when thinking of James and his career, and the importance of his work at the Fitzwilliam in particular, in collecting manuscripts and collecting materials for the archives, as well as becoming involved in archaeological fieldwork and other antiquarian researches of that period, is an incredibly important period in the museum's own history. And again, one which is reflected in his wider scholarship, which I shall come on to presently. And then during his time at Cambridge, he'd been at King's College as a student, and ultimately went back to King's College, running alongside his responsibilities at the Fitzwilliam to perform the role of provost, a role which he held from, as you can see again on the screen, from 1905 to 1918. And during that time, again, was involved in an enormous amount of regional and national scholarship of great significance, and we'll come back to that. But also is recorded very fondly in the memoirs of students and fellow staff, both in terms of his sort of conviviality and the esteem with which he held his friends and so on, and particularly as his social gatherings as well. You know, the fact he was always prepared to spend time with people, and particularly with things like the experiences of reading his ghost stories, because it's during this period in particular at King's where he was producing these stories on an annual basis to be read as part of his Christmas entertainments. And of course, Cambridge University during the First World War was not one of the happier places to be, The impact of the war on the student body was particularly great in terms of the loss of effectively a generation of young men. It had a very dramatic effect. And similarly, university grounds being used as military hospitals and so on, again, had a very negative effect. And so when we get towards the end of the First World War in particular, we find that James is offered the role of provost again, but this time at Eton College, going back full circle, if you like, back to the boarding school he'd attended as a youngster. And so from 1918 onwards, he switches back to Eton and occupies the role of provost there until his death in 1936. So you can see in some ways, by a sort of very brief biographical sketch there, a very institutionalized life on the one hand, moving from one institution to another and effectively back again. But on the other, a life which enabled him to explore and undertake some of the detailed, rich scholarship, which he became very well known for in his own lifetime, and which has subsequently informed generations of other researchers. And so what I want to do, having given you that sort of brief background, is just go in a bit more detail to look at some of his East Anglian work in particular, and look especially at how that work was interrelated with his personal life and his personal experiences of growing up in East Anglia, living in East Anglia, but also how the academic work which he undertook then bled through into some of the more famous ghost stories as well, because there are two or three of the ghost stories in particular which are firmly set in East Anglia, which draw upon East Anglian history and an East Anglian background. And there's a very strong crossover there with some of those. So we'll have a look at how those fit together as well. But really, in terms of his academic career, as I say, he studied at King's and got his doctorate in 1895. And really, 1895 marks something of a threshold year in terms of his academic career, because in 1895, he published at least 10 books on a variety of different subjects, and many of them representing catalogues of manuscript collections. And one of the things which James was very, very heavily involved with throughout his career was producing these descriptive catalogues of illustrated manuscript collections, primarily in the Cambridge colleges, but also in national museums and archives, and indeed in foreign archives as well. And so regularly throughout his career, he put out catalogue after catalogue after catalogue of these manuscripts. And many of those catalogues are so good and so detailed that their content has continued to be used today. So now, for example, with the Cambridge University catalogues, you can query online for particular resources, but when you drill down to the detail, what you're finding is very much still the detail that James produced in the late 19th century, for example. So that, on the one hand, was a very, very important piece of scholarship in and of itself. But the knock-on effect of that, which we can see in several of his different projects, is the fact that by sifting through all of these manuscripts and reading them and understanding them, and crucially remembering them, he was able to bring together disparate aspects of different parts of medieval history recorded in those documents, and bring them together and offer up interpretations of different places, different sites, different monuments. And that was a trick which he was to repeat on a number of different occasions across East Anglia and more widely, both in terms of the manuscripts themselves, but also in terms of the features and the sites which they were describing. And one of those sites in particular, one of the early sites which interested him, was the Lady Chapel at Ely Cathedral, which some of you may be familiar with. If you're not, it's a truly spectacular building, well worth a visit, as you can see from the photograph on the screen here. And James produced a pair of publications on the subject of the Lady Chapel in 1892 and again 1895, that threshold year. Because one of the things that James did, his familiarity with the chapel enabled him to do it, was those of you that know the building, and indeed those of you that don't, might be aware that all of the various niches which are decorated down the sides of the building that you can see on the screen there, many of those are decorated with small carved figures, most of which have been literally defaced or beheaded as a result of the sort of political ramifications of the later medieval and post-medieval periods, which leaves us with a large number of figures carrying symbols and items of regalia from which a biblical scholar would be able to recognize and interpret them. but from which the vast majority of the more modern audiences for these scenes would perhaps struggle to identify particular characters. And so this is where James's great strength as a biblical scholar in particular, and someone with a strong interest in biblical imagery especially, was able to bring that to bear on the symbolism which was being employed within the Lady Chapel in Ely. And he produced a pair of very detailed illustrated descriptions of the Lady Chapel itself, which put those scenes into context and enabled the figures to be identified and enabled the stories which those figures are telling to be reconstructed. And this was something which, again, he accomplished in the late 19th century, but really which has yet to be bettered to this day. And as a site and as a series of engravings, his interpretations remain at the forefront of our understanding of the Ely Lady Chapel. But it wasn't just Ely that he was interested in. I mentioned that he grew up in Livermere, which wasn't far from Bury St Edmunds. And again, in that year, 1895, James produced, and this is how I became involved with his academic work particularly, James produced a very, very detailed and important work on the Abbey of St Edmund at Bury. And this was a book which he had researched almost by chance, really, while compiling his catalogues of manuscripts, both in terms of coming across the manuscripts themselves, but also reading their contents and bringing them to bear on the Abbey, which of course was a site that he knew and loved. And so the book that he put together is here. It was published by the Cambridge Antiquarian Society, and it's a book which is in two parts, really. The first part, as you can see on the title page here, is labelled The Library, and the second part is labelled The Church. And really the point of what James was doing with this book in the first instance was producing a catalogue of the lost medieval library of the Abbey of St Edmund. Now, the Abbey of St Edmund was important for a number of reasons, not least because of holding the shrine which held the bones of Edmund himself, but it was also incredibly important on the national stage because of its role later in the development of the Magna Carta, for example. But amongst monastic circles and in sort of medieval monastic circles in particular, one of its foremost attractions was the fact that it had one of the largest libraries certainly in England in that period, totaling perhaps as many as 2,000 books, which for the period and for a monastic library is an incredibly impressive array. And what James was able to do was use some of the surviving library catalogues from the medieval period, of which there are a couple in Bury, and also the surviving manuscripts which he'd been able to identify in other collections, to produce effectively the catalogue of the lost contents of the library. And in some ways, it's rather a sort of romantic idea in itself, this idea that you could reconstruct a ghost library, as it were. And this is a feat which he accomplished with great success for Bury. And it's also something which he was able to undertake for other sites as well, in Canterbury and Norwich, for example, over the course of his career. And then the second part of that book, as you can see, concerns the church in particular, the Abbey church in particular. And what James was able to do, as I'll show you in a moment, is bring together many of the descriptive elements which he'd found in other publications, other manuscripts, and put them together to create effectively a guided tour of what the Abbey church in Bury would have looked like at its height in the 15th century. An incredibly impressive work in and of itself. And as you can see, dating from 1895, so again, relatively early in James's career. And we know from his personal papers held in a variety of locations, but particularly the personal papers held in the University Library in Cambridge, which is where this is my hand clutching rather feverishly James's own copy of the Abbey of St Edmund's book, into which he had continued to make notes and adjustments throughout the rest of his life. So we've got crossings out, we've got additions, but what we've also got interleaved in the pages are numerous pieces of correspondence with other specialists and others, and tucked into the pages in the relevant places. So it's a fantastic record of his ongoing involvement with Bury. And it was a subject that he came back to time and time again during his life. But in terms of the library in particular, I mentioned that he was able to use the catalogues but he was also able to use the sort of physical identifications of books, which had a very distinctive binding from the abbey in Bury St Edmund. So again, you can see in these photographs here a couple of books from the Pembroke College collections, showing you this very distinctive spine with the little tabs at the top and the bottom, which is a very characteristic Bury feature. And then because Bury had a very good librarian as well, we also find inside the books shelf marks too, which indicate a former history of the book having been held in the library in Bury. And so because James had produced these enormous quantities of manuscript catalogues, he was able to then make notes of where those volumes had ended up. And one of the reasons why I was undertaking the work on the Abbey and Barrow St Edmunds is because 2020, just gone, represents the millennial anniversary of the formal foundation of the Abbey in 1020. And as part of the Abbey celebrations, which have been rolled over now, incidentally, it's hoped that some of these original books from various collections will be brought back to the Abbey site in Bury for a while, to sort of bring them back to their spiritual home, as it were. And so the library itself is a fascinating subject in its own right. But really, from a sort of archaeological point of view, from a historical point of view, it's what James was able to do for our understanding of the Abbey church and the wider layout of the monastic precinct in particular, which really sets his work apart from those of others. And so here we can see on the screen a ground plan which James was able to produce based upon largely conjecture in terms of the ground plan. It needs to be remembered that the Abbey site in Bury was largely covered in rubble at this period in time. It hadn't really been excavated to the degree that it has been today. And so a lot of the layout of the church there, as you can see, shown in white at least, is conjectural. The black is more certain in terms of masonry, which had been uncovered by that point. But when you look at the detail of what James is doing here, you can see from the numbered key on the right-hand side, the letters and numbers, that he's identifying significant features within the Abbey church, particularly the locations of chapels, the locations of particular relics, and the location of significant graves as well, for example. And so all of this is derived really from little snippets which he'd come across in his various readings and the different manuscripts that he'd uncovered, because we don't have one single source for Bury that gives us that detailed layout of how the Abbey was put together. This was put together from fragments and brought together rather skillfully to create the whole. But rather than just creating the whole, as I've mentioned, he then presented it in the style of leading a guided tour, effectively, around the Abbey church in the 15th century, which takes it from the realms of sort of dry academia, if you like, into the much more lively and literary approach to presenting this information. It's a fascinating book. It's out of print, although it's been reprinted from out of copyright PDFs. And again, you can find scanned copies of this book online now as well. It's well worth looking at as a piece of historical research. So the contribution that James made in 1895 to the Abbey really hasn't been bettered in many ways by the subsequent 120-something years of scholarship. And so his role in terms of our understanding of the building, and particularly our understanding of its history, is really fundamentally second to none. And it deserves to be better known. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so grateful for the opportunity to spread the good word about this publication in particular. Now, off the back of his work in 1895, M.R. James got drawn into what became something of a national controversy, which occurred in 1901. Because I mentioned that one of the reasons why the Abbey of St Edmund was so significant is because of holding the relics of Edmund. And of course, one of the things that we don't know about the Abbey site is what happened to Edmund's relics at the point of the dissolution. We know that the shrine, and you can see the shrine illustrated here on the screen in a 15th century illustrated manuscript from Bury. This is from Lydgate's Life of Edmund, and is essentially an eyewitness drawing of the shrine. We know that the shrine was broken up at the point of the dissolution, but we don't know what happened to Edmund's bones. And there's much discussion locally and more widely about exactly where he may or may not still be buried. But that, again, is the subject for another day. But the point being that in 1901, it was claimed by a church on the continent that they held the relics of Edmund and that they'd been stolen from the abbey during the medieval period, and they were offered back to the newly, or in that case, being constructed Westminster Cathedral. And the idea was that these bones would be brought back and installed in the new Catholic cathedral. But this caused a degree of controversy, not least because it was widely accepted that they couldn't possibly be Edmund's relics, because the implication was they'd have been stolen long before the dissolution, and this didn't square. And so in that way that people did in 1901, this was dealt with very sternly through letters to the Times. And so in the course of 1901, in the late summer and the autumn, we find a series of letters from a variety of antiquaries who'd worked on the subject of Edmund, Ernest Clark among them, who we'll come back to, but particularly M.R. James, making very clear statements about why these relics, which were being held up as Edmund, couldn't possibly be Edmund. And this was set out very, very clearly. And as a result, the decision was taken not to install the relics, and they were held at Arundel Castle instead, where they still reside. And it wasn't until the 1970s and later that the bones were actually subjected to a degree of archaeological scientific research. And the research concluded that the bones in the casket represented a number of different individuals of both sexes, and that some of them had clearly been buried before, but not others, and that it wasn't possible to say for certain that they weren't Edmund, for example, but it was fairly clear that this wasn't a single body, this wasn't Edmund on his own, and that there was much ambiguity about these relics. And so it would seem that several decades after the event, that James and his cohort were proved to be correct. And of course, the mystery of where Edmund's bones are still survives out there somewhere in the landscape. But in terms of the impact that had on the Abbey of Edmund, it started to galvanise local support and local interest in the site, because up to that point, as I've already mentioned, most of it was buried in rubble. There'd been limited excavations in the 18th century and a few more little keyhole excavations since, but nothing substantive. And off the back of this controversy in 1901, it was decided to form a Bury Abbey Excavation Committee, in that way that people do, led by Sir Ernest Clark, who's an antiquary who'd worked extensively on translating some of the historical documents to do with the Abbey, for example, and had connections to Bury St Edmunds. And so the decision was made to undertake some excavations which might build on the work undertaken by James in his identification of particular locations around the Abbey site. And we have, surviving from that period, we have pamphlets and newsletters produced by the committee, which are held in various places. James's papers contain copies. There are copies in the Suffolk Record Office as well, for example. And it details the subscriptions. You can see on the screen here how the subscriptions were broken down that had been raised at that point. And so in late 1902, enough money had been raised to put a field team to work, and they began work on the monastic chapter house. And the reason why they began work on the chapter house was because this was an area that James had identified as being the location of a number of burials of the abbots of the abbey in particular. And again, it's an unpublished excavation, but I hope to publish it soon if I can. And but the records which survive indicate that work progressed rather nicely. In late 1902, they uncovered a number of buildings. I mentioned earlier on that interleaved in the pages of his own personal copy of the Bury book, James had inserted Bury-related material. One of the pieces of material that he inserted was this excavation plan, which he'd been sent, showing the progress of the chapter house. You can see the chapter house annotated at the bottom of the drawing there under the letter A. He included the plan in his book, but he didn't include the cover letter, unfortunately, which gave us a sense of what those other letters meant. But going through the archives in the Suffolk Record Office, for example, you find a copy of the cover letter which was sent to him. And so you can actually bring the pieces back together and begin to understand the plan. But again, it shows his ongoing interest in that excavation. He was the academic advisor to the work and visited the site on a couple of occasions, we believe. And the story goes that the excavation carried on in late into 1902. And then on New Year's Day in 1903, this is what was uncovered. So this is working down the centre of the chapter house, and you can see in the foreground there, you can see the tiles of the chapter house floor, and then running down the centre of the floor of the chapter house, you can see a series of stone coffins containing the skeletons of a series of the abbots of the abbey. And if we go back to James's ground plan, here's a little extract of James's ground plan. There's the published plan that he put together entirely from documentary descriptions as to where these abbots might be. And then you can see on the ground there the actuality. And what that means when we look at the numbering system that James has employed is that we can actually start to name and identify individual abbots running down the centre of the floor there. And the second one along, number 2 on that list, as you can see, is the great Abbot Samson, who is immortalised in Jocelyn of Brakeland's Chronicle of the Abbey of Barrow St Edmunds, which is a fantastic work in its own right of biography, both of Samson, but also of monastic life in general. A fascinating read. But Samson is also the abbot primarily responsible for the completion of the abbey church as well. So he's someone that we know a great deal about from the historical sources. And here in the early 20th century, the excavation of his mortal remains as well. Now, the skeletons themselves were lifted and studied and reinterred, and they were buried. There were grave goods in there as well. And so in Abbot Samson's grave, for example, we had a couple of artifacts. The one on the left is a little silver gilt ring, which seems to have belonged to his crozier staff. It seems to be a decorative mount for the crozier staff. And then on the right-hand side there, you can see a lead cross cropped into a Maltese cross shape. And this is one of several crosses which have come from the site, some of which are inscribed with evocations of the Holy Cross. And these seem to belong to a group of crosses which were used as part of the burial rites in Bury and some other monastic sites, but particularly in Bury, with a growing corpus of those. They're often picked up as stray finds. So to find one in the coffin of Abbot Samson is quite a significant thing. And both of these objects are on display in the Moyses Hall Museum in Bury St Edmunds. And as I mentioned, the skeletons were studied and reported on and ultimately reburied at the end of January 1903. And on top of the burials were laid new stone ledger slabs, which visitors to the site can still see today. And the skeletons are still there. And so the picture on the screen here is showing you an early postcard view of the reburial as it occurred. And then on the left-hand side here, you can see a note from James himself, which again is held by the Suffolk Record Office. And it shows you how bad his handwriting was. It's another characteristic of James. But it says basically, I'm afraid I shan't be able to join you for the reinterment of the abbots tomorrow. Bury them well. And I congratulate you on being freed of your lodgers, it says. Because the gentleman he's writing to here is one Mr. Dunn, who is the land agent for the Marquis of Bristol, who owns the site. And when the bones were lifted, they were lifted and stored in his house on the site. And so James here is showing something of his wit in congratulating him on being free of the abbots who've been lodging with him. And the idea that you'd have abbots lodging with you is perhaps something that might cross over into some of his ghost stories. And it's interesting to see, this is 1902, 1903. It's interesting to see that the first collection of ghost stories was published in 1904, so the following year. And it brings together in the anthology a number of ghost stories which he's written over the preceding Christmases, going back several years back into the 1890s. But the last story, which is produced for the anthology, is The Treasure of Abbot Thomas. And this is written specifically for the collection. So it's written in late 1903. And although it doesn't specifically reference the Abbey of Barrow St Edmunds, there are many passages of descriptive passages within that story, which focuses around the ransacking of monastic ruins in search of the treasure of a lost abbot, based on fragments pulled together from manuscript sources identifying the location of the treasure. There are many echoes there with the work being undertaken in Bury, at least at that particular point in time. So I think that there is a degree of inspiration there, if nothing else, drawn from that particular story and the work going on in Bury St Edmunds. But that brings us quite nicely to some of the other East Anglian ghost stories that I mentioned earlier on. And in that first collection, we have a couple of the most famous. The first is the ash tree, as it's known, and the second there is well, perhaps one of the most famous ghost stories, "Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad." But to look at the ash tree first of all, this is a very, in some ways, personal story for James, because it begins. Its setting is Bury St Edmunds, and it's set against the background of the witch trials which were held in Bury St Edmunds in the 17th century. Of course, James was very familiar with those through his studies, but also through his immense local knowledge. And so the beginning of the story focuses around the witch trials and a great injustice which is done as part of that process. But the story then subsequently moves, setting to the location of Castringham Hall. And the story revolves around particularly a woman who's put to death as a witch with the surname Mothersole. And when we go back to the churchyard in Great Livermere, for example, we find that Mothersole is a very common family name in Livermere parish, and that within the churchyard there are a large number of Mothersoles buried at Livermere, in the churchyard with which James would have been familiar as a child. And so we can see him borrowing the names here. But when we then turn to look at Castringham Hall in particular, we can take a descriptive passage from the book, which describes this fictional Castringham Hall as having an Italian portico, a square block white house, older inside than out, in a park with a fringe of woods and a mere. And we then turn from Great Livermere, where James was residing, to look at Livermere Hall, which is no longer with us. It was pulled down in the 20th century. But here is an engraving of Livermere Hall dating from the early 19th century, showing exactly the building that James is describing, set within its park, with Livermere, the mere itself, immediately adjacent. And it's no coincidence that this forms the setting of this very early story. And again, we can take great descriptive passages from that particular story and look at them in the context of Livermere and see that James is effectively describing the landscape with which he was most familiar surrounding his house, and then taking it into Bury St Edmunds and the history of the town there as well. Now, it should be stressed that, of course, James lived in Livermere Rectory, which was across the park from the hall itself, but he was certainly familiar with the woodland and the mere. And it's interesting to see that crossover between his lived experiences and the settings for his ghost stories. This is something which we also see more famously in the setting of "Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad," which, as I say, is one of his more famous stories, but it's also one of the stories which focuses particularly around archaeology as well as a discipline. And this again is a subject that was of great interest to him. He wasn't necessarily a practicing archaeologist, but certainly he was interested in archaeological things. And the story itself takes place on the Suffolk coast in the fictionalized town of Burnstow, which is a very thinly disguised Felixstone. And Felixstowe is a town with which James was incredibly familiar. He had friends in the town, he visited them regularly, stayed with them on many occasions. And so again, the descriptive settings of the landscape surrounding the town are very clearly set out in the story itself. And the story revolves around an academic, as many of his stories do, Professor Parkins, who goes off to Burnstow for his holidays, for a golfing holiday in particular. And here you can see on the left-hand side here a postcard view of the links to the north of Felixstowe, with a Martello Tower beyond. This is absolutely the location that James is thinking of when he's describing Burnstow. And during the course of his stay, Professor Parkin, who a colleague has asked to investigate the remains of a Templar preceptory, which are lying in the area. It should be said that is fictional. There isn't a Templar preceptory in the Felixstowe area, but he's investigating that, and he comes across a bone whistle. And so here is a screenshot from the very famous 1970s television production of the programme, showing Michael Horden plucking the whistle. This is actually filmed on location in Dunwich on the Suffolk coast, so again another Suffolk connection there. But as with all these things, the protagonist doesn't heed any warnings, and he blows the whistle. And having blown the whistle, immediately then starts to be haunted by visions. And here we can turn to the illustrations of the first ghost story, because it's quite interesting. One of James's friends, a man called James McBride, produced a series of illustrations for some of James's ghost stories. And McBride died, I think, very young. And James always maintained that he published that first collection basically as a tribute to his friend and as a way of including his illustrations in the publication. And so there are only 4 pictures created for those stories. And this is one of them. And this shows, as you can see, that the protagonist of the story collapsed in the foreground behind one of the groins on the Suffolk coast. And then in the middle distance in the background there, you can see the sort of ethereal white shape of the spirit which is haunting him and chasing him along the beach. And the illustration itself really does capture something of the desperation of the haunting, but it also wonderfully captures something of the sinister nature of the East Anglian coast as well at this point. And this is the early 20th century, sorry. And here we're seeing the groins, which are a relatively new development at this particular period. They're put in around that time, and it really does capture something of that very unusual liminal sense between the land and the sea, divided up by these regular intervals along the coast. And this is a scene with which James himself would have been incredibly familiar, because I put on the screen now, this is a postcard of Felixstone. This is Cobbold's Point, and you can see the big house in the background there is the lodge. And the lodge was owned by friends of James's, and he spent several periods of time in that house at Felixstone, visiting and socializing. And you can see in the foreground there the newly installed groins at Cobbold's Point, which are doubtless the inspiration for the landscape he describes in that particular story. Now, towards the end of O Whistle, I'll come to you, we're given this illustration as well, which shows the sort of denouement, like a sort of spoiler alert, it shows the denouement where the bed sheets come to life and overcome the protagonist. And again, the reason why this particular picture is interesting is because it captures something of the hotel which the character is staying in as well. You can see in the background there a bay window overlooking the sea, and these windows are described at length in the story, and they are an important part of the story as well, a very key part of the narrative. And again, we can turn to Felixstowe and its architecture, and we find many examples that would fit the bill, including this particular hotel. This is the Bath Hotel, which stood in Felixstowe in the period where James knew it. It was subsequently burnt down by the suffragette movement as a protest, but you can see it here in its finery, and you can see how the building itself here features exactly those sorts of bay windows that James describes in his narrative. So again, an incredibly important connection to local sites with which he was intimately familiar. Now, skipping on to some of the later anthologies, we have the More Ghost Stories of Lanternbree, which was published in 1911, and this has again a variety of different stories, none of which have a directly East Anglian connection. But the Stalls of Barchester Cathedral focuses particularly, as it suggests, on cathedrals and interior fixtures and fittings. And I suppose it's no coincidence that in the 1970s, the television production of the Stalls of Barchester Cathedral was filmed in Norwich, at the cathedral and in the cathedral close, and indeed in the cathedral library as well, which again is another subject which James had published on, featuring the great Robert Hardy in the television series. And but Norwich Cathedral is another of those sites with which James had a sort of largely unknown but incredibly important connection. Because many of you will be aware, I'm sure, that one of the major attractions of Norwich Cathedral, there are many, of course, but one of the major attractions of Norwich Cathedral is the fact that the roof is richly decorated with carved bosses which depict biblical scenes and tell stories. And there are many, many publications out there which interpret those and which illustrate them, and particularly now with high resolution photography and so on, it's possible to take good photos from ground level of these bosses. But back in the early 20th century, such investigations weren't so possible. And so a couple of James's early publications, again, focus on describing and interpreting and illustrating the bosses in the roof of Norwich Cathedral. And so the first of those publications that we see, again, focuses on what's called the Boughton Chapel in Norwich Cathedral. This is a small side chapel which has an elaborately carved sequence of bosses, which are illustrated with very early photographs here as well. And then each of these bosses is accompanied by a descriptive analysis by James. And of course, again, because he's looked at all these manuscript sources, because he has that detailed knowledge of biblical imagery, he's able to offer that commentary and interpret these figures and these stories in a way that others simply aren't able to do. Even in James's day, this is a skill which is being rapidly lost. And certainly by today, in a contemporary society, it's not something that many people can do at all in terms of recognizing those stories, recognizing those characters. So here is an example, it's just an extract from that publication, showing these wonderful early photographs here. And then the numbered key relates to a series of descriptive passages written by James. And then he complements that later on in 1911 with a detailed description and analysis of the bosses which are to be found within the cathedral cloisters as well. And again, these tell a lot of Old Testament stories running around the cloister in chronological order. And the book here again is published and illustrated, this time with a wonderful set of drawings. And again, here's a couple of examples. These aren't drawn by James. He was no draftsman and he never claimed to be one. But these drawings were drawn by someone else and held by the Norwich Archaeological Society. And so a very early collaboration between James and the Archaeological Society saw the publication of these wonderful little sketches, these drawings. It's a truly exquisite volume, again, deserves to be better known. Not very many copies produced. They're hard to come by, and it's hoped that one of the things that we might see happen soon is this being digitized and made available more widely, which would be a wonderful thing to see happen. And as I've mentioned, the bosses of the cathedral have since been interpreted and published on numerous different occasions. But many of those publications all go back, as with the manuscript catalogues, to James's early descriptions and his early interpretations of those particular features. And so, again, we owe an enormous debt to him for his work on Norwich Cathedral. And later in his life, when a centenary volume was being put together for the celebration of the cathedral church itself, they commissioned James to write a chapter on the bosses. So he was seen as the early authority on the subject of the bosses themselves in Norwich. And again, those of us with East Anglian connections and East Anglian passions owe a great deal to him for that. Now, skipping through the later ghost stories, we've got the Thin Ghosts and Others is one particular collection, which doesn't really have anything with a particular East Anglian connection. But perhaps the other most famous of the East Anglian stories comes in his final collection of ghost stories, A Warning to the Curious and Other Ghost Stories, 1925, so relatively late in his career at this point. And it is that title, the Warning to the Curious, which features his strongest East Anglian setting. And it's written late in his life, and it has this very sort of whimsical, nostalgic feel to it. And it draws the most sort of evocative portraits of the fictional town of Seaborough, which is Aldborough. Those of you who know East Anglia may have been to Aldborough. And Aldborough is a town with which James had family connections. His mother's family were from Aldborough. He regularly holidayed in Aldborough every year, and he stayed at the White Lion Hotel, which you can see in the background of this image on the promenade. In the foreground, you can see the medieval Moot Hall, the meeting place for the town council and so on. But in the background there, a hotel which James stayed at regularly. And that hotel is fictionalized in the story of The Warning to the Curious. And the central tenet of the story is again based around archaeologists and their background. But the idea behind the story is the notion of three protective crowns, which are buried in the ground in East Anglia to protect the East Anglian kingdom from invaders. And these crowns are meant to be Anglo-Saxon. And what James is doing here is very skillfully weaving together fact and fiction, if you like. So the imagery of the three crowns is something which goes right the way back to the realm of Edmund in particular. And so the symbol of the three crowns is something which we find in that context with Edmund and his abbey in particular. And it becomes a symbol of the East Anglian kingdom. And we find it carved onto churches. This is Woolpit Church on the right-hand side here. We find it carved onto churches and in other decorative schemes across the region. But what we don't have is by way of a backstory, effectively, in real life. And so what we have here is James inventing a fictional context for this three crowns imagery, and entirely inventing this idea that the three crowns are buried to protect the kingdom. And this is something which is then bled through into folklore And you find several sort of more serious works of scholarship on folklore which have picked up this legend of the three crowns and presented it as traditional East Anglian folklore. But of course, none of them were able to trace it back further than 1925 when James publishes that story. Now, the central idea of the story is that the location of the last of these crowns has been discovered by an archaeologist. It's always the archaeologist, you want to watch out for them. But it's been discovered by an archaeologist who can't resist but to steal it. And so what we have here is a very detailed description of the excavation of a barrow, in particular, the location and then excavation of a barrow. And during the course of which the protagonist, called Paxton, digs into the side of the mound and extracts the Anglo-Saxon crown, whereupon he immediately begins to be haunted by the ghost of one of the ancestral guardians of the crown. Now, of course, the idea of barrow excavations on the East Anglian coast is something that's particularly close to our hearts anyway in the context of Sutton Hoo, but and obviously even more so now with the dig being so popular at the moment. But it needs to be remembered that James is writing this in 1925 or just before, and this is a period before, of course, the major excavations that have been undertaken at Sutton Hoo. And so although we can read it and immediately think of the parallels there, this isn't actually what James is inspired by. And it seems much more likely that his descriptions of the Barrow excavations and so on are being inspired by excavations which were undertaken at the site of Snape in 1862. Now, Snape is a village not very far away from Sutton Hoo. It's down in southeast Suffolk, and it's actually on the main road to Aldborough. And it's also got ship burials in it, and but not of the same degree of grandeur as was later discovered at Sutton Hoo itself. But here we have a wonderful manuscript illustration, a beautiful cross-section and plan of the excavation of one of the ship burials made in the 19th century by a beautifully named archaeologist, Septimus Davison. And you can see there all the characteristics we come to recognise at Sutton Hoo, with rows of rivets laid out in the ghost of the ship in the ground. And indeed, it was these rivets in the Aldborough Museum that Basil Brown had seen, which caused him to subsequently recognise them when they began to be uncovered at Sutton Hoo. So it seems very likely that James is inspired by his knowledge of the Barrow excavations at Snape, for example, when he's thinking of the excavation passages in the Warning to the Curious. And of course, the notion of an Anglo-Saxon crown itself is very interesting as well, because it's not something which we widely associate with the Anglo-Saxon kings, and it's not something that we historically have any examples of. But what we do have are tantalizing glimpses in the history of a crown having been discovered previously. And if you return to James's travelogue, his Suffolk and Norfolk volume that I mentioned earlier on, he records that at Rendlesham in 1687, a silver crown reputed to have been Redwold's was dug up, and it is painful to relate, was melted down almost at once, so that we know nothing of its quality. And again, those of you who are familiar with the wider context of Rendlesham will realise that it's identified as being the royal manor in Bede's historical ecclesiastical history, and has obviously recently been subject to much archaeological investigation of its own. But here we have a reference, which is ultimately coming from Camden's Britannia, I think, which tells us about the discovery and loss of this particular crown. And so again, James is weaving together the known history of the discovery of this crown, the reputed role with Rendlesham and Redwold, the Anglo-Saxon king, who of course is primarily now identified as the king buried at Sutton Hoo, although again in 1930 James wasn't to know that, and bringing it into his story to give it that added sense of history. Now again, the denouement of A Warning to the Curious is played out against the background of another of the famous historical monuments which we find on the Suffolk coast. This is the Martello Tower at Aldborough. This is a near contemporary postcard view of it, a battery surviving at its base. And again, without giving away too much of the detail, the protagonist comes to a sticky end in the shadow of the Martello Tower. And here again, James is able to describe it in detail and invoke at length something of the atmosphere of the place. Coastal erosion has meant that a lot of this feature has subsequently been lost to us and the Martello Tower itself is now converted to a holiday home, but it's still very clearly identifiable as the setting of James's masterpiece. And many argue that A Warning to the Curious is his best and most convincing and most evocative ghost story. And certainly if you read it while in and around Aldborough, it's very, very clear to work out the locations of various parts of the book, including up to and including the location that he chose for the site of the burial of the crown itself, which is easily identifiable on the heath to the north of the town, although anyone reading the story would be sensible not to go and explore that too closely. Now, I've mentioned later on in his life that he produced this travelogue of Norfolk and Suffolk, and of a region which he loved enormously. And as I said, that's very, very clear from his passions throughout his writings, from the asides that he wrote, from the extensive letters that he wrote. Haven't even touched on those really, but he was a prolific letter writer, and obviously made many allusions to East Anglia in there. On the subject of his Suffolk and Norfolk volume, which again is a wonderful read and full of esoteric knowledge, but also cutting asides as well about the state of life today in the 1930s particularly. It shows a wonderfully Victorian look on things like the coming of the motor car and American tourists and so on. There's some beautiful asides about things like that. And of the subject, he says, I have many early associations which endear these two great counties to me, and the attempt to expound some of their manifold attractions to those who live in them and those who visit them has been a very pleasant task. He clearly loved the East Anglian region. And that brings us really to the end of his life. That 1930 publication was one of his last. And he died while in post in Eton, and is buried in the cemetery at Eton. And here you can see the gravestone for him there. But as a nice local touch, the M.R. James Society unveiled a plaque to him in Great Livermere Church not that long ago, so 15 years ago, 20 years ago or so now, maybe a little bit longer. And so here you can see on the wall of Livermere Church itself the plaque to the memory of Montague Rhodes James, 1862 to 1936, Provost of King's College, Cambridge, and later of Eton College, noted theologian and antiquary, author of many ghost stories. He spent his boyhood in the rectory here. Again, a wonderful monument to an incredibly important and influential man. And I want to end with a very brief extract from a lecture which James gave in the Athenaeum in Bury St Edmund in April 1932, very, very late in his life. He was invited back to the town to give a rousing lecture on the subject of the Abbey Church in particular. And here he was following in the footsteps of other famous writers such as Dickens and so on, who had addressed the town in the same venue. And I was particularly fortunate during the research into the Abbey to uncover the handwritten manuscript of his lecture from the Cambridge University Library collection. And I was given permission by the family to publish a transcript of that lecture in the 2020 edition of the Proceedings of the Suffolk Institute of Archaeology and History. And so for the first time that lecture has been made available. And we're hoping that it might be possible to stage a reading of it or something similar in Bury to celebrate the foundation of the Abbey still. But I want to quote to you the last paragraph of that lecture which James gave, which sums up both his passion for the Abbey itself, but also, I think, having seen other comments, his passion for East Anglia more widely. And it says, "My wish has been to impress upon you the ancient beauty and splendour of the great church, and the fact that in the unexplored ruins of it, you have the happiest hunting ground for the historian and antiquary that is to be found in the length and breadth of England." And on that note, I'd say thank you very much indeed for taking the time to listen to me this evening. I hope that's given you an insight into some of the other aspects of M.R. James's career, which perhaps you hadn't been familiar with. You might, like me, have come to him knowing him as his ghost stories and finding his scholarship. You may have come to him the other way around. But I hope that this evening's lecture at least has given you the chance to begin to understand and appreciate something of the breadth and depth of his scholarship and the areas within which he was interested. And as I've said, time and time again, the different aspects of research I've been undertaking in East Anglia, I've come across the fingerprints of M.R. James a good 100 years earlier than everybody else. And very, very rarely have we been able to better the conclusions reached in his own work. So thank you very much indeed for your time. And I'm happy to attempt to answer any questions which you may have.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, for that very, very interesting lecture. And as Richard has indicated, he says he will be happy to answer questions. So if you have questions, can you put them in the chat? And Matthew, who's going to help us this evening, will read them out. But while you're doing that, perhaps I can just sort of raise a few points myself. I mean, what struck me, Richard, I don't know whether you've got any sense of this yourself, is how James, like many of these other sort of late Victorian figures, and I'm thinking of people like J.H. Round, for example, John Horace Round, were remarkably energetic. I mean, they're vastly productive. You know, you mentioned that he was a prolific letter writer. He was an administrator. You know, he was running the Fitzwilliam. He was provost of King's College and of Eton. And at the same time, he was still finding time to do this scholarly work and to write ghost stories. You know, how does he fit? How does he sleep? How does he manage to do all this remarkable thing? Do you have any sense of, you know, how he managed to do so much?
Yeah, I mean, he's absolutely prolific. It's incredible. And in some of the later tributes to him that were published by his friends fairly early after his death, they attempt to put together bibliographies which span, you know, literally hundreds of items that he put out. Quite incredible. And I think it's probably partly because of the lifestyle that he chose to live in terms of being institutionalized to a certain extent. So in many ways, you know, you've got board and lodgings covered, and so you don't have to worry about those sorts of things. All that kind of stuff is taken care of for you, I suppose. So I suppose there's an element of that. But I think reading it, you know, he's obviously just driven to get this material out there, you know, and there's nothing which doesn't seem to catch his eye in terms of academic interest. And his manuscript catalogues, I say the descriptions that he puts together are, you know, on the one hand could be seen as a very mundane piece of cataloguing, but his prose style is such that those descriptions really do leap off the page and conjure the images. Yeah, this is in a period where it's a purely descriptive exercise. There aren't the images to go with it, but yeah, absolutely prolific. It puts the rest of us to shame, I think, quite frankly, in terms of our own meagre output for these things.
Yes, well, I think you make the point, though, that without a need to cook, without a need to shop, and perhaps without a need to look after your family.
Indeed.
You do have, the day stretches out much more fully than it does for the rest of us. So if you have questions, I don't know, Matthew, whether there are any questions. If you have any questions, please would you like to add them into the chat. Matthew, are there questions that have come through? I think
stunned silence is always good.
I mean, I think what also impressed me, can I say, Richard, was also the sort of the themes which ran through what you had to say. I mean, I was thinking that on the one hand, you've got this sort of rather Gothic-like ghost stories, and the other hand, you have this fascination clearly with Gothic architecture. You know, and this interplay, I think, of the scholarly with the imagination, I think, is perhaps quite remarkable. And it's difficult to think of another person who has quite managed to balance and to provide a play off one sort of aspect against another quite so successfully. I can't think of another antiquarian or archaeologist who has been quite so successful in that regard. I don't know if
that's right. And once you start to see both ends of the equation, as it were, you can see the crossovers much more closely. I mean, I've only really been able to work on the East Anglian stories particularly and see the immediate crossovers there. But I'm sure if we were to look at the context of the other stories with which I'm less familiar, and the other regions within which those stories are set, we would find very, very similar crossovers. But in terms of striking that balance, as you said, I alluded at the beginning there to figures like Tolkien, for example, who again came at his writings from a very strong academic background. Again, the influence of the First World War is there as well as a life-changing experience, which again is a different thing, which has been explored by others. And so you sort of see these very, very significant academic figures being remembered primarily as writers of particular things. Again, C.S. Lewis is another figure in a similar situation, best known in the popular mindset, at least for that, but in academic circles, really at the top of their fields. It's quite interesting when he's invited back to Bury to give the lecture in 1932. That's the year after the first collected version of his ghost stories has been published. And as I said, he was following in the footsteps of figures like Dickens, for example. So it was very much a literary event rather than a sort of scholarly event, that he was being invited as a known author at that point in his life, rather than as an authority on Bury St Edmunds. And so the lecture that he gave is absolutely fascinating, and again sort of revisits a lot of the material he published in 1895, but does show that there was still an interest there, both personally from his point of view, but also from the townsfolk who turned out in large numbers to hear him speak, by all accounts.
I think that's also rather a sobering thought, that literature on the whole has survived, but you made the point that a lot of M.R. James' work, his scholarly work, I mean, may have been influential, but the publications have not been reprinted up to now.
But that's one of the wonderful things about the internet now as well, is that many of his catalogues are available digitally as PDFs, because a lot of his work is out of copyright now, almost all of it, excuse me, with the exception of some of the unpublished material, which is retained by the family. But all of his printed works are now out of copyright. And so as part of initiatives like Google Books and the Internet Archive and so on, large numbers of his early works have been scanned and are available now, which they weren't previously. So again, even 10 years ago, trying to do research of this kind into Bury Abbey and other places, I'd have struggled to get hold of a lot of these sources. But actually now, many of them are freely available in pretty good high definition scans. And so it is possible now to track down things like the Lady Chapel at Ely, for example. Some of those really early works, it's possible to locate good digital copies of that material.
Matthew, are there any questions that have been posed for Richard?
We have a few questions from Lindsay Fulcher, sorry. And one of the first questions is, can you recommend a reader of M.R. James's stories? Well,
I mean, there is a single collected volume which has all of them in terms of the paperback. But if you're after an audio book in particular, the best reader of the audio books, I would say, is the Michael Horden versions, which were recorded a long time ago, into probably the late 70s or early 80s, but which very recently have actually been re-released on Audible. Other platforms are available, but have been released again as recordings, although they've been floating around on the internet for quite some time. And those were the copies that I had on cassette as a child. And I think for me, Michael Horden is the voice of M.R. James in audiobook form. So I would certainly recommend that you track down his versions. But I mentioned the live versions as well. And there's an actor called Robert Lloyd Parry from Nunkey Theatre Productions, who does live recordings and is again online, and his are very, very good. So well worth checking out his DVDs and his YouTube channel and so on. And again, ideally live performances again before too long.
Thank you. Matthew, are there other questions?
What's asked here is, Also, what was James's view of the supernatural? Was he a skeptic?
Mm.
Presumably, he was a Christian.
He was indeed, yes. He was very devoutly Christian, and so that's one of the quite interesting contradictions in his character, if you like, is that difference between his quite devout belief. It would seem, and for a while he contemplated the priesthood before he became an academic, and I think his father had intended that he would join the priesthood rather than become an academic. And so, yes, he certainly had that. On occasion, well, throughout his life, he maintained that he didn't believe in ghosts, I think is the main line. But then he wrote a very short story right at the end of his life called A Vignette, which is based, I didn't cover it, but it's based in the grounds of Livermere and Rectory, effectively. It's an account, sort of vaguely fictionalized account of an experience he thinks he had as a child, where he saw a face in the garden through a keyhole. And so, you know, there is a suggestion that he perhaps had some of these experiences himself, but certainly throughout his life, he maintained that, you know, these were just exercises in literary fun, really, and sort of sat there as fiction primarily, but inspired by, as you've seen, you know, classical mythology and antiquary research and so on that he'd come across, particularly things like he transcribed a series of medieval ghost stories, for example, from a monastic document, which again is published, and gave us some of the medieval sources that perhaps had inspired him. So we've got things like that, and then with things like Count Magnus, for example, you know, one of his equivalent of the vampire stories, for example, he thought Dracula was a bit much. He was always a bit derogatory of Dracula in terms of its overtones, but you know, he had a Scandinavian inspired vampire story in Count Magnus, for example, which again draws from the sagas and so on. And so, you know, you can trace the literary roots of his ideas back to those sorts of sources.
Matthew, are there any other questions? Well, I think all that remains is for me to thank Dr. Richard Hoggart for really an absolutely fascinating lecture, which brought together for me aspects I knew, of course, was familiar with M.R. James's work, and I knew that he was a Cambridge scholar, but I had no idea of the connections that existed between his scholarly activity and his ghost stories. And I think by setting them in context, by providing a historic and topographical context, it has vastly illuminated, you know, both aspects of Montague Road James' life, and it's absolutely fascinating. So now I'm going to go off and read more of the ghost stories with what you have in mind. So can I thank, on your behalf, Richard, for a really terrific, very informative, well researched lecture, and wish you all good evening. Thank you very much, Richard. So we will metaphorically or virtually clap you, but I hope you feel that we are doing so in your presence anyway.
Thank you very much indeed. Right. It's been a pleasure.
Good. Thank you.